Alright, here's how it started. So, a couple of months back, my wife, Sophia, and I were at her company's holiday party. I wasn't exactly thrilled to be there. I'm more of a homebody, especially on a Friday night after a long week. But Sophia wanted to show me off, she said, and it felt nice knowing she was proud to have me by her side. Looking back, I feel like a fool for believing that. Sophia looked stunning, I'll admit that much. She was dressed to the nines, in this shimmery blue dress that hugged her in all the right places. Every time she laughed or smiled, it was like the whole room's attention turned to her, and I was just the lucky guy holding her hand. Or so I thought. The night dragged on as these events do. There was small talk, awkward jokes, and coworkers I didn't know, mingling for no real reason. But Sophia seemed to enjoy herself. She kept bouncing around, introducing me to everyone. Then came the moment she wanted to introduce me to Daniel. I'd heard of him in passing, her colleague, the work bestie. I remember Sophia saying how funny and supportive he was, how he always knew how to cheer everyone up at work. The guy looked harmless at first, just your average friendly coworker type. He shook my hand with a big smile, acting like he was thrilled to meet me. I didn't think much of it. I remember Sophia stepping aside to chat with some other coworkers, and I was left alone with Daniel, making awkward small talk about sports or something equally meaningless. At one point, Sophia had a little too much to drink. She laughed louder, hugged her coworkers tighter, and kept finding reasons to whisper in Daniel's ear. I don't know what got into me, but I felt a strange knot in my stomach. I tried to shrug it off. I trusted her after all. We'd been together for years, built a life, shared dreams, and everything. She wouldn't betray that, right? But as the night went on, she started disappearing. I'd see her for a few minutes, then she'd vanish. I'd look around, trying to act casual, but my gut wouldn't settle. Eventually, I decided to check out the back hall near the coat closet. Call it intuition or paranoia, but something just pushed me to look. And that's when I found them. I found them, all right. In the dimly lit hallway near the coat room, there they were tucked away, thinking nobody would see them. Sophia was leaning into him, their faces way too close. They didn't notice me at first, too wrapped up in each other. I felt my heart drop, my hands clenched so hard my nails dug into my palms. When I finally forced out, "Sophia, what the hell are you doing?" they sprang apart, both looking like deer caught in headlights. Sophia started stammering, "Michael, it's not what it looks like." The classic line. I just stood there, barely breathing, waiting for her to keep lying to me. She tried to laugh it off, saying they just had too much to drink and were fooling around, but the way she looked at him, man, I wasn't buying any of it. And I could see the guilt written all over her face. Daniel tried to jump in, stumbling over his own excuses, saying, "It was just a stupid mistake, man. Don't make it into something it's not." His voice cracked, his gaze glued to the floor. But I'd already seen what I needed to see, and it didn't matter what garbage they fed me. There was no mistaking what I'd walked in on. I saw red. I stepped closer to Daniel, felt that rage boiling over, and before I knew it, I had him pinned against the wall. I let my fists do the talking. One punch landed square on his jaw, knocking him off balance. He scrambled to get up, mumbling something about not wanting any trouble. But I wasn't done. I threw another punch, this one even harder, letting him know exactly what I thought of his mistake. By this point, people had started gathering, whispering and pulling out their phones. Some of Sophia's friends tried to pull me off, but I wasn't budging until I'd let every last bit of that rage out. Seeing Daniel squirm, humiliated in front of everyone, gave me some twisted sense of satisfaction. At least he wouldn't forget this night anytime soon. Finally, I let him go, my fists throbbing, and turned to Sophia. She looked horrified, frozen in place. I didn't say a word to her, I just walked out, leaving her there in front of all her friends, with the consequences of her actions for everyone to see. I drove home in silence that night. My mind was blank, a buzzing numbness settling in after the storm. I thought about all the times I'd trusted Sophia, about the years we'd spent building our life together. I couldn't wrap my head around how easily she'd thrown it all away. It was nearly dawn by the time she came home. She must have stayed back to do damage control or maybe to try and find some excuse, any excuse, to make this all go away. But when she finally walked through the door, she looked defeated. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Michael, can we talk?" Her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't respond at first. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and tried to see the woman I'd fallen in love with. But all I saw was a stranger who'd shattered my trust. She started rambling, saying she was sorry, that it was just a drunken mistake, that it didn't mean anything. But those words didn't hold a drop of meaning for me. When I finally spoke, it was with a calm I didn't recognize in myself. "Do you love him, Sophia?" She flinched, like I'd slapped her, and started shaking her head. "No, Michael. I swear, I don't love him. It was stupid, a one-time thing." But I cut her off. "So why? Why throw everything we had away? Why lie to me day after day, and act like nothing's wrong?" She stammered, mumbling excuses about stress and feeling underappreciated. She even tried to turn it around, saying I'd been too focused on work and too distant lately. I could feel my blood boiling again as she tried to make it sound like it was my fault. Like I'd somehow driven her to betray me. "You really think blaming me is gonna fix this?" I spat, feeling that anger clawing back up my throat. "I was there, Sophia. I did everything for you. Don't try to tell me this is on me." That shut her up for a second, and she just stood there, looking down at her feet. I knew then that there was no going back from this. There wasn't a single word she could say that would ever make me feel whole again. "Pack your things," I told her, my voice cold and steady. "You can stay with a friend, with Daniel, I don't care. But I want you out by tonight." She looked stunned, like she hadn't expected me to actually kick her out. She started pleading, crying again, but I'd already shut down. I turned my back, walking to our bedroom and slamming the door behind me. The sound of her sobbing outside felt like a dull echo, fading away with everything else I'd felt for her. I wasn't angry anymore. Just empty. The next day, I woke up to an empty house. Sophia had packed her things and left, just like I'd told her to. For a moment, standing there in the quiet, I wondered if this was all some twisted nightmare I'd eventually wake up from. But it wasn't. The silence only confirmed it. She was gone, and so was everything I thought I knew about our life together. I spent that day making calls. First, I called a lawyer. I wanted the divorce in motion immediately, and I needed to protect myself. Sophia might try to come back, pleading for forgiveness, but I wasn't about to let her snake her way into my assets or drag this out in court. My lawyer was sharp, no nonsense, and went straight to the point, explaining what needed to be done to protect myself. She told me to gather records, document everything, and to be ready for any games Sophia might play. It was comforting, having someone on my side who knew how to fight. By the next day, Sophia started texting. The messages started out pitiful, full of apologies, begging me to let her explain. But then, when I didn't answer, they turned defensive. She said things like, "We had problems long before this, and you're not blameless, Michael." It was like she couldn't resist trying to twist the knife. After a couple of days of ignoring her, she showed up at the house. I didn't let her in, just talked through the door. She started crying, saying, "I made a mistake, but I love you, Michael. Don't throw away everything we have." I took a deep breath and told her, "You're the one who threw it away, Sophia. You made your choice." When she saw she wasn't getting anywhere with tears, she shifted tactics. She threatened to contest the divorce, to go after the house, my savings, anything she thought she could get her hands on. I knew she didn't have a legal leg to stand on, but I could see she was willing to fight dirty if it meant causing me pain. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "If you go that route, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly why we're getting divorced. I'll tell our friends, your family, and I'll have no problem naming Daniel and explaining what happened at that party. So think carefully about how you want to handle this." She went pale, her bravado gone in an instant. Without another word, she turned and left. I knew I'd hit her where it hurt. Her reputation mattered more to her than I ever did. And that's when I realized I'd finally taken back control. After that showdown, things went quieter. Sophia backed off, probably too afraid of the damage I could do if I told everyone about her affair. Word had already started to spread around her office. People had seen the scene at the party, and I guess rumors took on a life of their own. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction knowing that her own actions were catching up with her. But it wasn't enough to fill the emptiness. I was trying to keep my head above water, but every corner of that house reminded me of what I'd lost. I couldn't stay there, surrounded by memories of a life that no longer existed. So I did something I never would have imagined doing. I started selling things. First, I got rid of the small stuff, photos, gifts, those souvenirs we'd picked up on vacations. Then I sold the bed, the furniture, all the things we'd picked out together. I wanted to erase every trace of her from my life. Then came the biggest decision of all. I sold the house. It was a fresh start, a way to break free from everything that tied me to Sophia. I didn't care where I'd go, I just needed to feel like I had control again. The moment the sale went through, I packed up my essentials, bought a second-hand motorcycle, and left with nothing but a duffel bag and the clothes on my back. My friends thought I'd lost it, asking if I was okay, where I was going, what my plan was. But I didn't have a plan. I just wanted to ride, to feel the wind and get lost, as far away from that old life as possible. For weeks, I drove from town to town, staying in motels or sleeping under the stars. I didn't have a destination, I was just following the road, letting it lead me somewhere new. One evening, after a long day of riding, I found myself in a small town I'd never heard of. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the streets were quiet by nightfall. I was low on gas and patience, so I pulled into a diner on the edge of town, hoping for some coffee and a meal that wasn't from a gas station. As I walked in, I noticed a woman sitting alone in a corner booth, with a little girl beside her. She looked worn out, her hair a bit messy, and dark circles under her eyes. But what caught my attention was the way she watched the door, glancing around like she was constantly on guard. Her daughter, a small curly-haired kid with big brown eyes, was playing quietly with a crayon, drawing on a napkin. I sat at the counter, trying not to stare, but the whole scene felt off. After a few minutes, the waitress brought my coffee, and I noticed the little girl looking my way, her eyes wide with curiosity. I gave her a small wave, and she smiled shyly, hiding her face behind her mom. A few minutes later, the woman came up to the counter with her daughter in tow. She looked nervous, shifting on her feet before she spoke. "Excuse me, are you heading out of town?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah. Just passing through," I replied, curious. She hesitated, then glanced down at her daughter before looking back up at me. Would you mind giving us a lift? I know it's a lot to ask, but we really need to get to the next town over." There was something in her eyes, a desperation, a plea for help, that made me pause. I could have said no, kept to myself, but something about her struck a chord. Maybe it was because I knew what it felt like to be running from something. "Sure," I said, nodding. "I can give you both a ride." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you," she said, managing a small, grateful smile. As we left the diner and headed toward my bike, I couldn't shake the feeling that our paths had crossed for a reason. Amy, she told me her name as I helped her and her daughter, Olivia, settle onto the bike. I gave her my spare helmet, and Olivia clung to her mom, wrapping her small arms around her waist. I could tell Amy was nervous, probably hadn't done something like this before. But she held on tight, and with a quick nod, we set off down the quiet, winding road. The ride was short, only about 20 minutes to the next town, but it felt like I'd crossed into a new chapter of my life. The weight I'd been carrying since Sophia's betrayal started to lift, just a little, as the road stretched out in front of us. Amy held onto me tightly, and every now and then, I could hear Olivia laughing behind me, thrilled by the wind rushing past. That small sound broke something open in me, a crack of warmth in a place that had been cold for too long. When we reached the town, I pulled over by an old motel. Amy climbed off, helping Olivia down, and turned to face me. She looked grateful but wary, as if she wasn't used to people doing favors without asking for something in return. "Thank you," she said, brushing her hair back as she steadied Olivia. "I don't know how I can repay you." "No need," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just glad I could help." For a moment, we just stood there. I could see something flickering behind her eyes. Maybe trust, maybe fear. "Are you all right?" I found myself asking, not sure why I cared so much. Amy hesitated, looking down at her daughter before answering. "We're getting away from someone. My ex. He wasn't good to us," she said quietly, glancing around as if she still feared he'd pop out of nowhere. It hit me hard, realizing that this woman and her daughter were on the run, just like I was, though for very different reasons. I felt an urge to help them, to make sure they were safe. "Well, if you need anything, I'll be in town for a couple of days. Feel free to reach out." I scribbled down my number on a scrap of paper and handed it to her. She took it, nodding with a slight smile. "Thanks, Michael," she said, her voice softer than before. I watched them walk into the motel, feeling a strange mix of emotions. I hadn't expected to care about someone else's problems. But maybe, just maybe, I'd found something or someone to make this journey feel a little less empty. I spent the next day trying to focus on my own plans, if you could call them that. I rode around town, stopping by the local diner for coffee, trying to clear my head. But my mind kept drifting back to Amy and Olivia, wondering how they were doing. Part of me wanted to let it go, to stay out of it. After all, I barely knew them. But another part of me, a part one hadn't felt in a long time, kept tugging me back. That evening, I was heading back to my motel when I noticed Amy and Olivia sitting on a bench outside the small grocery store. They looked tired and out of place, and I didn't like the way a couple of men were glancing at them from across the street. Something just felt off. Without thinking, I walked up and gave them a nod. "Hey, fancy seeing you two here," I said, acting casual, though I could feel my pulse picking up. Amy looked up, surprised but relieved. "Michael. We were just getting a few things, but, they won't let us stay in the motel much longer." She tried to smile, but I could see the worry etched in her face. They were running low on options, and from the looks of it, cash too. I glanced over my shoulder at the two men, then back at Amy and Olivia. "How about I take you both out for a meal? My treat." Amy hesitated, glancing down at Olivia, who was looking up at her with hopeful eyes. Finally, she nodded. "All right. Thank you. I can't say no to food right now." We headed over to a small diner down the street, the kind of place with booths and sticky tables, where the menu hasn't changed in decades. We ordered burgers and fries, and for the first time, I saw Amy and Olivia relax a bit. Olivia even started telling me all about her favorite cartoons, her bright little voice filling the booth as Amy smiled softly, letting her guard down just a little. After dinner, as we walked back toward the motel, I couldn't ignore the feeling pulling at me. "Look," I said, turning to Amy, "if you need a safe place, there's a town about an hour from here that has shelters and resources for situations like yours." Amy looked at me, surprised, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. She was wary, unsure if she should trust a stranger. But something softened in her expression. "Maybe we'll take you up on that," she murmured, squeezing Olivia's hand. In that moment, I realized helping them wasn't just about doing a good deed. It was the first time since the divorce that I'd felt a sense of purpose. The next morning, I packed my bike and went by the motel, half expecting Amy to have left already. But there she was, standing outside with Olivia by her side, a couple of bags on the ground. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept, but there was something different in her eyes, determination, maybe. I nodded at her, trying to keep it light. "Ready for a new start?" She looked at Olivia, then back at me, and managed a small smile. "Yeah, I think we are." We strapped her bags to the bike, got everyone set up, and took off down the road, leaving that little town behind. Olivia was thrilled, laughing and pointing out everything we passed, from cows to billboards, like it was the most exciting thing in the world. Amy held on tight, but I could feel the tension slowly easing out of her with every mile we put between us and whatever she was running from. After about an hour, we reached a bigger town where I knew there was a shelter and a support center that could help Amy get on her feet. We parked near the shelter, and Amy climbed off the bike, stretching and looking around, taking it all in. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice steady but her eyes misting up. "I don't think I can ever repay you for this." "You don't have to," I said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Just focus on you and Olivia. Take it one step at a time." The shelter staff welcomed her warmly, especially when they saw Olivia clinging to her side. I watched as they helped her fill out paperwork, guiding her toward the resources she'd need to rebuild. For a second, I considered just leaving. My part was done, and she was in safe hands now. But something held me back. When she was done with the paperwork, she walked over and took my hand, giving it a firm squeeze. "You know, I thought the world was full of people who didn't care," she said, her voice quiet but full of gratitude. "Thank you for proving me wrong." I didn't know what to say. All I could do was nod and squeeze her hand back. There was a lot we didn't know about each other, but we didn't need to. Somehow, without words, we understood each other's scars. As I started to leave, Olivia ran over and hugged my leg, giving me a grin that just about melted me. "Bye, Michael. Thank you for the ride," she chirped, waving her little hand. With a heavy heart but a light step, I walked back to my bike, watching them from a distance as they walked inside the shelter together, ready for a new beginning. I was alone again, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel empty. I left that town thinking I'd done my part and that it was time to keep moving. I rode aimlessly, hitting small towns and back roads, trying to clear my head and let go of all the bitterness I'd been carrying since Sophia's betrayal. But no matter how many miles I put behind me, I couldn't shake the image of Amy and Olivia, especially that look in Amy's eyes when she thanked me. After about a week on the road, I found myself pulling up to another diner in a quiet little town. I ordered my usual coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the empty streets and wondering what my next move was supposed to be. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt this nagging pull, like I'd left something unfinished. Finally, I gave in. I pulled out my phone and called the shelter. They transferred me to Amy, and when I heard her voice on the other end of the line, it felt like the pieces of something I didn't even know were missing were suddenly falling into place. "Michael," she asked, sounding surprised but pleased. "I didn't expect to hear from you." "Hey, Amy. Just checking in. How are you and Olivia?" She laughed softly, a sound that instantly lifted something heavy off my chest. "We're doing okay. They're helping me find a job, and Olivia's adjusting well. She keeps talking about the motorcycle ride, by the way. You're all she talks about." I smiled, relieved to hear they were settling in. But I realized there was more I wanted to know. "Do you need anything? I don't mind coming by to help if you need it." There was a pause, and then she spoke, her voice a little unsteady. "Actually, Michael, we'd love to see you." So I rode back, taking my time and wondering what I was getting myself into. But when I pulled up to the shelter and saw Amy and Olivia waiting outside, waving at me, all my doubts melted away. That evening, we went out for pizza. Olivia talked my ear off, laughing and telling me all about her new toys and friends. Amy was quieter, watching her daughter with a soft smile and glancing at me every now and then, like she was trying to figure out why I'd come back. At the end of the night, as we walked back to the shelter, Amy pulled me aside. "Thank you, Michael. I don't know why you're doing this, but it means a lot." I looked at her, at the way she held herself with both strength and vulnerability, and realized something had shifted in me. "Maybe I needed this as much as you did." She smiled, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I felt like I had a purpose. I didn't know where this path would lead, but for once, I didn't need to. After that night, I started visiting Amy and Olivia more often. At first, it was just once or twice a week, bringing small things they might need, helping Amy with errands or just playing with Olivia, who quickly warmed up to me. I'd never been one to connect with kids before, but there was something about Olivia's endless curiosity and her innocent trust that got to me. She'd reach for my hand or tell me stories with that little spark in her eye, and I'd feel this strange warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Amy and I started opening up to each other, little by little. She told me about her past, how she'd fallen for a guy who seemed kind at first, but over time, his true colors came out. She'd stayed with him longer than she wanted to admit, hoping things would change, especially for Olivia's sake. But when things got worse, she knew she had to escape, no matter how hard it would be. Hearing her story hit close to home. I hadn't faced anything as extreme, but betrayal leaves similar scars. We'd both been hurt by people we trusted, and that mutual understanding became this invisible thread between us. One sunny afternoon, I took them both out on a short hike nearby. Olivia ran ahead, picking wildflowers and showing each one to us, and Amy and I walked side by side, feeling the ease of something new and gentle unfolding. At one point, Olivia got tired, and I carried her on my shoulders the rest of the way. Amy laughed, watching her daughter sit high up, laughing and tugging my hair, and I realized it had been a long time since I'd heard her laugh like that. On the way back, Amy looked at me, a soft, almost shy expression in her eyes. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again, not like this. I didn't know what to say at first, so I just took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here, Amy. I'm not going anywhere." For a while, we stood there, just taking in that moment. And I knew without a doubt that this wasn't just about helping them out or making up for my own past. This was something new, something real. It was a second chance at a life I hadn't planned on but was finally ready for. After that day, things changed. Amy and Olivia began to feel less like people I was helping and more like family. I started staying longer each visit, helping Amy settle into her new job and sometimes picking up Olivia from the daycare when Amy worked late. The trust between us grew naturally, day by day, like this unspoken promise that we'd be there for each other. One night, after I'd brought over some takeout, we ended up watching a movie together at her place. Olivia snuggled up beside me, drifting off halfway through. When Amy noticed, She smiled and quietly thanked me for all the times I'd been there. I brushed it off, but she wouldn't let it go. "You don't understand, Michael," she said softly, her eyes holding mine. "I never thought I'd find someone I could trust, someone who'd care about us like this. You've been a miracle for me and Olivia." Her words hit me hard. I'd spent so much time feeling like I'd been drifting ever since Sophia, like I didn't belong anywhere, didn't have a purpose. But here, with Amy and Olivia, I felt grounded again, like maybe I was exactly where I was meant to be. Without thinking, I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers slipped between mine, warm and steady. I felt a rush of something I hadn't felt in so long, a mix of hope and certainty. As the movie ended, we carried Olivia to bed together, gently tucking her in. Standing there in the soft glow of the night light, Amy looked at me, her expression tender and open. "Michael, I know we've both been through a lot. But maybe it's time for both of us to start over. Together." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep inside me. "I'd like that, Amy. I really would." We shared a quiet smile, a silent agreement, before she led me back to the couch. We sat in the dark, talking late into the night, sharing stories, dreams, and all the small hopes we'd thought were lost. In that moment I knew I'd found my home, and it wasn't a place. It was with them. The weeks after the fair were transformative in a way I hadn't expected. Life settled into this quiet, steady rhythm that felt like home in a way I hadn't felt in years. Every morning became a ritual. I'd stop by the local bakery for fresh coffee and pastries, swinging by Amy's place to surprise her. Sometimes she'd already be up, her hair in a messy bun, her face lighting up when she saw me at the door. Other times, I'd catch her mid-rush, Olivia wrapped around her leg, her arms juggling everything from car keys to an overflowing bag. And every time, she'd give me that look, the one that told me I was exactly where I was supposed to be. On weekends, I'd stay over to help around the house, fixing little things like leaky faucets or squeaky doors. Amy would laugh, teasing that I'd become her handyman, but she'd flash me that grateful smile that said everything words couldn't. Olivia took to calling me buddy, and she'd trail behind me while I worked, peppering me with questions and handing me imaginary tools. I found myself explaining things to her as if she were my own, guiding her hands as she helped me tighten screws or measure something. The bond we were building felt deeper every day, a quiet understanding growing between us that needed no explanation. One Friday, Amy had a late shift, and I offered to pick Olivia up from daycare. I could tell she was hesitant, her eyes full of worry, but when I insisted, she finally agreed, her relief unmistakable. When I arrived at the daycare, I waited outside, watching the kids pour out, until I spotted her. Olivia's face lit up the moment she saw me, and she ran over, arms wide, throwing herself around my legs in the biggest hug I'd ever gotten. "Michael," she exclaimed, her eyes shining. "Hey, kiddo. How was your day?" I asked, ruffling her hair. She launched into a story about her artwork, her new friend, and even a super big bug she'd seen outside. On the way back, she chattered non-stop, and I just listened, feeling my heart soften with each of her stories. By the time we got home, I realized I knew every detail of her day, and it made me feel closer to her in a way I hadn't thought possible. That evening, Olivia and I decided to make a surprise dinner for Amy. I let her choose the menu, spaghetti, garlic bread, and a salad, and we dove into the kitchen like it was a grand adventure. Olivia insisted on decorating the salad, which turned into an enthusiastic crouton fest. I may have burned the garlic bread a little, and the kitchen was a mess, but we laughed our way through it, sharing a moment that felt so natural, so right. When Amy walked through the door that evening, she froze, taking in the sight of the table set with mismatched dishes, the slightly scorched garlic bread, and Olivia bouncing with excitement. "We made dinner for you, Mommy." Olivia beamed, running over to show her the fancy salad. Amy's eyes softened, and she looked at me, her gaze filled with something more than just gratitude. She hugged both of us, her embrace lingering a little longer when it came to me. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Both of you." After dinner, Olivia begged for a story, and this time she wanted me to read it. She climbed onto the couch, snuggling up between Amy and me, her head leaning against my shoulder. By the time I'd finished the story, Olivia was fast asleep, her small hand resting on my arm as if she didn't want to let go. Amy glanced at me, her expression warm and filled with an unspoken depth of feeling. We carefully carried Olivia to her bed together, tucking her in under her favorite blanket. As we stood over her, watching her breathe softly, she stirred and mumbled, Good night, Mom, good night, Dad. Amy and I exchanged a glance, frozen in place. I could see the shock and the emotion in her eyes, mirroring my own. For a moment, we just stood there, processing those words, letting the weight of them settle. It was just a slip, probably a reflection of what Olivia had started to feel, but in that single moment, everything felt so much more real. Back in the living room, Amy and I sat in silence, letting the moment linger. She looked at me with eyes full of vulnerability, her voice barely a whisper. She's never called anyone that before. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. I took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. She doesn't have to, Amy. But she deserves to feel safe, to feel like she has a family. And so do you. Her hand tightened in mine, and I felt her lean against me, her warmth a steadying presence. We stayed like that, side by side, just listening to the quiet around us. After a while, she broke the silence. Michael, she began softly, her gaze fixed on our hands entwined. I never thought I'd feel this way again. I thought, after everything, I thought I'd lost the chance to have something real. But you've shown me that maybe I haven't. I felt a lump in my throat as I took in her words. Amy, I feel the same. I didn't expect this. I didn't think I'd ever want to try again. But you and Olivia, you've given me something I didn't know I needed. She turned toward me, her face inches from mine, her expression open, unguarded. I think I'm falling in love with you, Michael, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, as if afraid of what might come next. Without thinking, I leaned in, closing the distance between us, and kissed her softly. It wasn't rushed or passionate, it was gentle, a promise in its own way. When we pulled back, she was smiling, her cheeks flushed, her eyes shining with a new kind of hope. From that night on, we became something more, something that felt as unbreakable as it was natural. We spent almost every evening together, sometimes with Olivia and sometimes alone, sharing quiet moments over dinner or talking on the porch under the stars. We talked about dreams, about plans, and the life we could build together. The walls we'd both put up came down, replaced by a deep, abiding trust. One Saturday, we took a drive out of town to a small festival. Olivia was thrilled, tugging me toward every booth and ride, her laughter echoing around us. Amy stood back, watching with that soft smile that seemed to say everything without a single word. We were becoming a family, and I felt it in every shared glance, every laugh, every hand I held. On the drive back, Olivia fell asleep in the back seat, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Amy reached over, her fingers lacing through mine as she looked at me with that familiar, grateful gaze. I've never been this happy, Michael. Not once in my life. I squeezed her hand, my own heart full. Me neither, Amy. And I don't plan on letting this go. As the weeks passed, our bond only grew. I began to think about the future, about making a life with Amy and Olivia, and for the first time, it felt possible. Every moment with them made the bitterness of my past feel distant, like a memory that didn't define me anymore. This wasn't just about healing, it was about building something new, something beautiful. And standing there in that cozy, quiet life we were creating, I knew I'd finally found my purpose. It wasn't in some grand adventure or sweeping romance. It was right here, in the everyday moments with Amy and Olivia, in the warmth of a love that was as steady as it was real. This was my family, and I was finally ready to make it my forever. As time went on, everything just started to feel right. We were no longer just spending time together or filling gaps in each other's lives. We were building something that felt real and steady. I could see it in Amy's relaxed smile, in the way Olivia would reach for my hand without a second thought. Every little thing, every quiet moment, added another layer to the life we were creating together. One evening, Amy had a rare night off, so we decided to stay in and cook dinner as a family. Olivia was beyond excited. She insisted on being the head chef, taking on the very serious job of stirring the pasta sauce while I chopped veggies and Amy prepared a salad. The kitchen was filled with laughter and clumsy little moments, like Olivia accidentally flicking sauce onto her face or Amy trying to keep a straight face as Olivia gave her serious cooking instructions. After dinner, as Olivia snuggled up on the couch with her favorite blanket and a picture book, Amy and I sat across from each other, sipping wine, talking about nothing and everything. It was in those moments, surrounded by warmth and laughter, that I realized just how deeply I wanted this life. I didn't want just a day here and there, a few nights of closeness only to part ways in the morning. I wanted every day, every night, every ordinary and extraordinary moment that came our way. And I wanted it with them, This little family that had somehow become my whole world. A few nights later, as Olivia was getting ready for bed, she pulled me aside, looking unusually serious. "Michael," she whispered, tugging on my sleeve, "are you my friend forever?" I kneeled down to her level, my heart twisting at her question. "Of course, kiddo," I said, smiling as I tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "For as long as you'll have me." She seemed satisfied with that answer, nodding before giving me a quick hug. "Good. 'Cause I love you," she mumbled into my shoulder before darting off to her room. Those words stayed with me, lingering long after she'd fallen asleep. Later that night, as Amy and I sat on the porch, her head resting on my shoulder, I found myself whispering, "I love you, Amy. And I love Olivia." I don't think I realized just how much until now. Amy looked up at me, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. "We love you too, Michael," she said softly, her voice filled with an emotion that mirrored my own. "And I think it's time we start talking about what that means for us. For the future." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. "Amy, I want this to be my future. I want you, I want Olivia. I want us, together. Forever." She reached for my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Then let's make it happen. Let's make this our life." Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was time to take a real step forward, to solidify what we already knew in our hearts. I began quietly planning a proposal, wanting it to be something meaningful but simple, something that reflected the life we shared. I didn't want grand gestures or elaborate speeches. I just wanted to show her, in the best way I knew how, that I was all in. The following weekend, I suggested we take a day trip to a nearby lake, just the three of us. Amy looked at me with a playful smile, clearly sensing something was up but not pushing it. We packed a picnic and set out, with Olivia chattering excitedly from the back seat, talking about everything from ducks to rocks she hoped to find by the shore. When we arrived, we found a quiet spot by the water, spreading out a blanket and enjoying the simplicity of the moment. Olivia was in her element, gathering rocks and twigs, laughing as she skipped along the shoreline. I watched her with Amy, feeling the fullness of my heart, the absolute certainty of what I wanted to say. After lunch, as Olivia played nearby, I turned to Amy, pulling her hand into mine. "Amy," I started, my voice steady but thick with emotion. "You and Olivia. You've given me a life I never thought I'd have. A real family, a real future. I can't imagine a single day without you two by my side." She looked at me, her eyes filling with that familiar warmth, her hand squeezing mine. "Michael, I can't imagine it either." With a deep breath, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring, holding it out between us. "Will you marry me, Amy?" I asked, feeling my heart pound as the words left my mouth. "Will you let me be part of this family for the rest of our lives?" For a moment, she just stared, her hand covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. And then she nodded, laughing and crying at the same time, pulling me into a tight embrace. "Yes, Michael," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Just then, Olivia ran over, her eyes wide as she saw the ring and the tears. "What's happening?" she asked, looking between us. Amy knelt down, pulling her into the hug. "Michael just asked me to marry him, sweetie," she explained, her voice filled with joy. "He's going to be part of our family." Olivia's face broke into a huge grin, and she threw her arms around both of us. "Yay. I always wanted a dad." Hearing her say that, in her small innocent voice, felt like the final piece falling into place. I hugged them both, feeling the overwhelming sense of belonging and purpose I'd been searching for all my life. That night, as we drove home under the stars, Amy's hand in mine and Olivia sleeping in the back seat, I knew that I'd finally found my forever. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was the start of the life I'd been waiting for, the life I never thought I'd have. And I was ready for every single moment of it, with them by my side. The weeks after the proposal were filled with a kind of happiness I didn't know was possible. The three of us started planning our new life together, talking about everything from wedding details to where we'd live and what schools Olivia might attend. Each conversation, each little decision, brought us closer as a family. Amy and I decided on a small wedding, something intimate, just a few friends and close family. She didn't want anything extravagant, and neither did I. We just wanted a day that was ours. Even Olivia got in on the planning, insisting she help pick the flowers and begging for a sparkly dress so she could look like a princess for the day. On the morning of our wedding, I arrived early to the small outdoor space we'd chosen, a clearing surrounded by trees, with wildflowers scattered across the ground. The place was peaceful, almost magical, and it felt like the perfect setting for what was about to be the most meaningful day of my life. As friends and family gathered, I felt this quiet anticipation build inside me, a mixture of joy and disbelief that this day was really happening. Then, as the music started, I looked up and saw Amy walking down the aisle, holding Olivia's hand. They both wore soft, simple dresses, and their smiles were brighter than the sun filtering through the trees. Olivia gave me a little wave, beaming with that same innocent joy she always carried, and Amy, well, she was breathtaking. I'd never seen her so radiant, so at peace. The whole world seemed to melt away until it was just the three of us, standing at the edge of a new beginning. When they reached me, Olivia let go of Amy's hand and slipped her small fingers into mine. I could see the pride in her eyes, her excitement that we were all becoming one family. And as I took Amy's hands in mine, I felt that same sense of rightness I'd felt the first day we met. This was where I was meant to be. The ceremony was simple, just a few heartfelt words shared under the open sky. We spoke our vows quietly, promising not just love, but trust, respect, and a commitment to build something strong and lasting. As I slid the ring onto Amy's finger, I felt an overwhelming gratitude that life had given me a second chance. The moment the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close as I whispered, "Thank you, Amy, for everything." Afterward, we celebrated with a small reception nearby, a mix of laughter, food, and joy that seemed endless. Olivia was everywhere at once, twirling in her dress, showing off her princess shoes to anyone who would look. Friends and family gathered, sharing stories, toasting to our future. And through it all, Amy and I never left each other's side, soaking in every moment. Toward the end of the evening, Olivia pulled me aside, her face serious. "So, are you my dad now? For real?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and excitement. I crouched down to her level, feeling a lump in my throat. "Yes, Olivia," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "For real. I'm here to be your dad, every single day." She threw her arms around my neck, hugging me as tightly as her little arms would allow. "I love you, Dad," she whispered, and I could feel the weight of those words settle deep in my heart. I hugged her back, knowing I'd treasure that moment forever. As the night grew quiet and guests began to leave, Amy and I walked back to the clearing, hand in hand. We sat on a bench beneath the stars, the gentle sound of the trees swaying around us, and took in the stillness. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat in comfortable silence, letting the enormity of the day settle in. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've given us more than I ever thought we'd have, Michael. You've given me a home." I kissed her forehead, feeling a warmth that spread from my heart to every part of me. "You've given me that too, Amy. I never thought I'd feel this whole, this loved." We stayed there until the stars filled the sky, feeling more at peace than we ever had. I knew that challenges would come, that there would be difficult days, but I also knew that we'd face them together. I'd found my purpose, my family, my home, and I was ready to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of it. When we finally stood to leave, I looked back at the clearing one last time, holding Amy's hand tightly in mine. This was the beginning of a life I'd never dreamed of, a life built on love, trust, and second chances. As we walked back, Olivia skipped beside us, her hand in mine, and I realized that my heart had never felt so full. With Amy and Olivia by my side, I was ready for whatever came next.